The bank lobby was quiet, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional tap of fingers against phone screens. Customers stood in neat lines, waiting for their turn, their eyes flicking up to the digital display overhead. Everything seemed normal. But in just a few moments, this quiet routine would be shattered. A man in a tailored suit walked confidently to the counter. He looked sharp, polished shoes, crisp shirt, and a wristwatch that spoke of success. He wasn't here to play games. He was here for one reason, to withdraw his money. He slid his bank card and ID across the counter, offering the teller a polite nod. "I'd like to make a withdrawal. 100,000. The teller, a young woman, glanced at the ID, then at the screen in front of her. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She frowned. Then, without a word, she stood and walked away. The CEO's eyebrows lifted slightly. That was odd. Usually, these transactions went smoothly. Minutes ticked by. The teller hadn't returned. Instead, he saw her whispering to a man in a suit, probably the manager. The manager's face darkened as he listened. Then, both of them turned to look at him. The CEO remained calm. He had done nothing wrong. After a long pause, the manager strode toward the counter. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't even introduce himself. He simply folded his arms and said, "Sir, we can't process this transaction." The CEO's expression didn't change. "Why not?" "We need further verification." The CEO narrowed his eyes. "You already have my ID. I've been a client here for years. What exactly needs verifying?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "This is just standard procedure." "That's strange," the CEO said, his voice smooth but firm. "Because I've withdrawn larger amounts before." "No problem. So what's different today?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the security guard by the entrance. A silent signal. The CEO exhaled slowly. He had seen this before. He had heard the stories. But he never thought he would be living one. The guard took a step forward. The CEO straightened, his voice dropping to a low, even tone. "Are you about to remove me from my own bank?" The manager lifted a hand. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." "I'm not the one making this difficult," the CEO replied. Other customers were starting to notice. Heads turned. Murmurs spread. The CEO reached into his pocket, not for his wallet, not for his ID. For his phone. He pressed a single button and lifted it to his ear. "Yeah," he said, his voice carrying through the lobby. "I want you to get every news outlet on this. They need to see how this bank just treated its biggest client." The manager's face twisted. "Sir, there's no need to escalate." The CEO smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Oh, I think there is." The manager's face turned pale as the CEO ended his call. The bank lobby, once a place of quiet transactions, had now become a stage for something far bigger. Customers whispered, glancing between the manager, the teller, and the man standing firm at the counter. The security guard hesitated. He was waiting for the next move, unsure whether to follow through with the silent order or step back. The CEO put his phone away and crossed his arms. "I'll give you one last chance. Process my withdrawal. Now." The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, we're just following protocol." The CEO let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Protocol? Let me ask you something. If I were a different man, standing here in a different skin, wearing a different face, would you still be asking for verification?" The bank manager didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for itself. The CEO's voice remained steady. "Do you know how many times I've been in this bank? How much money I have in your system? You didn't seem to have a problem cashing my checks or taking my deposits. But now, when I want access to my own funds, suddenly there's a protocol?" The manager looked away. The CEO leaned in slightly. Tell me, who are you verifying me with? The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked back at the teller. She was frozen in place, gripping the counter, her face tight with discomfort. Let me save you the trouble, the CEO continued. I'm already verified. The moment I handed you my ID and account number, this should have been done. But you made a choice. A choice based on your assumptions. The tension in the room thickened. The manager tried to regain control. Sir, we have every right to ensure that. You have the right to follow the law, the CEO cut in. And right now, you're violating it. The manager flinched at the words. Just then, the glass door swung open. A tall woman in a sharp navy suit stepped inside, walking with purpose. His lawyer. The CEO smirked. Now we're going to have a real conversation. The lawyer approached the counter, setting down a folder with a crisp thump. She didn't bother with introductions. This is a legal demand for immediate access to my client's account. Failure to comply will result in an immediate lawsuit and a formal complaint filed with federal banking regulators. The manager visibly swallowed. He hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. I need to speak with my regional director, he stammered. The lawyer tilted her head. Oh, you'll be speaking with a lot of people soon. That's not the question. The question is, will this bank survive the headlines that are about to drop? The manager's lips pressed together. He glanced toward the security guard again, but this time, the guard took a step back. He wasn't getting involved in this mess. The lawyer folded her arms. You have two options. You process the withdrawal now, or we take this further. I suggest you choose wisely. The manager hesitated for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned to the teller. Release the funds. The teller let out a breath, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The printer hummed, spitting out a slip. The manager slid it toward the CEO, without looking up. There, he muttered. The CEO glanced down at the paper. See? That wasn't so hard. The lawyer wasn't done. You're also going to provide a formal written apology. The manager's head snapped up. Excuse me? You heard me, she said coolly. Or would you like to explain to the press why one of the most successful black CEOs in the country was treated like a fraud in his own bank? The manager's face burned red. He didn't respond. The CEO pocketed the slip, giving the manager one last glance. Don't worry. I'll be seeing you again soon. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the bank drowning in silence. Outside, reporters were already gathering, microphones ready. The real battle was just beginning. The CEO stepped outside into a wall of flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. The moment the bank door swung shut behind him, the questions came flying. Sir, what happened in there? Were you denied access to your own money? Is this racial discrimination? The CEO held up a hand, silencing the crowd. He was a man of control, and he wasn't about to let emotions take over, not yet. He had a plan. He always did. He took a slow breath, then spoke into the cluster of microphones. What just happened in that bank is something that happens to people like me every day. The only difference? I had the resources to fight back. A ripple went through the reporters. Pens scratched against notepads. Camera shutters clicked. One journalist stepped forward. Can you clarify? Did they refuse your withdrawal? The CEO's jaw tightened. Not at first. They stalled. They made excuses. And when I pressed them, they called security. All because they couldn't verify me. The reporter frowned. But, you're one of the most well-known business leaders in the country. The CEO gave a dry chuckle. You think that mattered? The crowd murmured again. Another journalist raised a hand. What do you plan to do about it? The CEO's eyes darkened. Oh, I'm going to do something. Something they won't forget. He turned, walking toward his sleek black car parked at the curb. His lawyer matched his pace, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Inside the car, she pulled out her tablet, scrolling. The story's already trending. People are furious. The CEO nodded. Good. She glanced at him. So, what's the next move? He exhaled. We make them squirm. We make them explain. And then, we make them pay. Back at the bank. Inside the bank, the air was heavy. The manager sat behind his desk, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. His career was crumbling right in front of him. His assistant knocked hesitantly before stepping inside. Sir, the regional director is on line 1. The manager swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming. With a shaking hand, he picked up the phone. Hello, sir. The voice on the other end was cold. What the hell happened? The manager stammered. It was a misunderstanding, sir. A misunderstanding? The director cut him off. You just denied one of our biggest clients his money and made him look like a fool in front of the world. Do you have any idea what this means for us? The manager closed his eyes. Sir, I was just following protocol. You were following your bias, the director snapped. And now the entire country is watching. The manager's heart pounded. What do we do? There was a pause. Then, the director spoke in a low, firm voice. We fix this. And you're going to be the one to do it. The manager's hands felt clammy. How? You're going to call him. You're going to apologize. Publicly. The manager blanched. Publicly? Yes. And if he wants your job, you're going to give it to him. The line went dead. The manager slumped back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. His life was about to change, and not in the way he'd ever expected. At the CEO's office. Hours later, the CEO sat in his high-rise office, watching the city lights flicker below. His assistant walked in, phone in hand. Sir, it's the bank. He took the call, putting it on speaker. The manager's voice was shaky. Sir, I want to personally apologize for today's events. The CEO leaned back. Do you? Yes, sir. I take full responsibility. The CEO stayed silent. Let the man sweat. Then the manager took a deep breath. I'd also like to invite you back for a formal apology. From the bank. The CEO raised an eyebrow. He could already guess who had forced this call. He smirked. Oh, I'll be back. But not for your apology. There was a long pause. Then the CEO said, I'm coming back to expose everything. Click. He ended the call. His assistant turned to him. What's the plan? He folded his hands. We're going to make sure no one ever has to go through this again. His lawyer smiled. I like where this is going. The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. The next morning, the CEO sat at his office desk, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through his phone. His name was everywhere. The story had exploded overnight, spreading like wildfire across news stations and social media. Top CEO denied access to his own money. Was it racial profiling? Bank faces backlash after mistreating one of their wealthiest clients. The comments section was a battlefield. Some people were outraged, calling for justice. Others tried to defend the bank, saying it was just a mistake. But the truth was clear, this wasn't an isolated incident. It had happened before. It would happen again. Unless he did something about it. His assistant walked in, holding up her tablet. Sir, the bank just announced a press conference. The CEO leaned back. Damage control. She nodded. They're scrambling. Trying to spin it. He smirked. Let them try. Just then, his phone rang. His lawyer. Tell me you have something, he said as he answered. Oh, I have something, she replied, her voice laced with satisfaction. I went digging. This bank has a pattern. Lawsuits. Complaints. All swept under the rug. Turns out, you weren't their first victim. You were just the first one powerful enough to fight back. The CEO's eyes darkened. How bad is it? Bad. I found multiple reports of Black and minority customers facing extra verification for large withdrawals. Some were denied outright. Others had accounts frozen. And guess what? The bank has paid settlements to keep them quiet. He exhaled slowly. Send me everything. She chuckled. Already did. The CEO hung up and glanced at his assistant. Get the press on the line. I want an exclusive interview. Her eyebrows lifted. You're going public? He nodded. Not just about me. About all of it. At the bank's press conference. The bank's regional director stood behind a podium, forcing a smile as cameras flashed. The manager was beside him, looking stiff and uncomfortable. First and foremost, the director began, we deeply regret the unfortunate incident that took place yesterday. This was a misunderstanding, and we have since reached out to our valued client to offer our sincerest apology. A reporter raised a hand. Is it true that your bank has a history of discriminatory practices? The director's smile faltered. That's not accurate. We uphold the highest standards of fairness and integrity. Another journalist spoke up. Then how do you explain the past lawsuits? The director hesitated. We are constantly working to improve our policies. The room buzzed with murmurs. Then, the door swung open. The CEO walked in. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The camera swung toward him. The journalists turned, suddenly far more interested in him than the bank's carefully crafted speech. The regional director's face paled. Mr. But the CEO didn't even look at him. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke directly to the cameras. You want the truth, he said. Here it is. The CEO's counterattack. The CEO pulled out a folder and held it up. This is a list of complaints filed against this bank over the past 5 years. People just like me. People who were denied their money. People who were humiliated. And do you know what happened to them? He opened the folder and tossed several pages onto the table. They were ignored. Or worse, paid off to stay silent. The journalist scrambled to grab the papers. The CEO continued, his voice calm but full of authority. Yesterday, when they denied me my own money, they didn't just make a mistake. They revealed a pattern. A problem. And I won't let it be buried again. The regional director cleared his throat. Sir, The CEO cut him off. No. You had your turn. Now it's mine. The room was dead silent. He took a breath. I built my business from the ground up. I worked twice as hard for every opportunity. I played by the rules. And still, in a place where my money should have spoken for me, someone decided I didn't belong. He turned to the cameras. So I ask you, if this can happen to me, what's happening to people who don't have a platform? The silence stretched. Then, a journalist spoke. What do you want to happen next? The CEO smiled. Change. Back at the CEO's office. Later that evening, the CEO sat in his office, watching the news. His speech had gone viral. People were calling for investigations. Protests were forming outside bank branches. The public wasn't letting this go. His lawyer walked in. You did it. He nodded slowly. Not yet. But we're getting there. She smirked. And the bank? The CEO's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The bank's board of directors. He smiled. Oh, he said, standing up. They'll be begging to talk. The CEO sat at his desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from reporters, calls from investors, and emails from people sharing their own stories of discrimination. The bank's press conference had failed to calm the storm. If anything, it had made things worse. His lawyer sat across from him, scrolling through her tablet. The bank is in full panic mode. Their stock is dropping. Their investors are worried. And, she smirked, their board of directors wants to meet with you. The CEO leaned back, rubbing his chin. They're desperate. She nodded. They want to contain the damage. He exhaled slowly. Let them wait. I want them to sweat. Just then, his assistant walked in. Sir, we have a visitor. Who? She hesitated. The bank manager. The CEO's eyebrow lifted. He hadn't expected that. Send him in, he said. A moment later, the very same manager who had denied him his money stepped through the door. He looked like a different man, his confidence was gone. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped. Mister, the manager hesitated. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry. The CEO said nothing. He let the silence stretch, let the man feel the weight of his own actions. The manager swallowed hard. I made a mistake. A big one. And now? I'm paying for it. The CEO leaned forward. Are you? The manager let out a shaky breath. They're firing me. The board wants someone to take the fall, and, he gave a bitter chuckle, it's me. The CEO tilted his head. And you came here because? The manager hesitated before answering. Because I need you to understand. I wasn't acting alone. I was following the culture of that place. I didn't create it. I was just another piece of it. The CEO studied him for a moment. And now that the culture has turned on you, you suddenly care? The manager flinched. The CEO sighed, shaking his head. What do you want from me? The manager met his eyes. A chance to make it right. A deal with the enemy. The lawyer scoffed. You want us to believe you've changed overnight? The manager turned to her. I want to help expose them. I know things. The internal emails. The unspoken rules. The real policies that aren't written down but enforced every day. If you want to bring them down, I can help. The CEO studied him. And what do you get out of this? The manager sighed. I've already lost my job. But if I help, maybe I can leave with a little dignity. The CEO leaned back. Interesting. His lawyer crossed her arms. And how do we know you won't just turn on us the moment they offer you something better? The manager gave a sad smile. Trust me. They're done with me. The CEO drummed his fingers on the desk. He knew the type, the kind of man who went with the flow until the current turned against him. But, if the manager had real information, this could be a game changer. Finally, the CEO nodded. Fine. But you don't move unless I say so. The manager exhaled in relief. Understood. The bank's boardroom showdown. Later that evening, the CEO finally returned the bank's call. Within an hour, he was sitting across from the board of directors. There were 6 of them, all dressed in expensive suits, looking tired and stressed. They had built an empire of money and power, but now, they were losing control. The chairman leaned forward. Mr. CEO, we'd like to formally apologize for what happened at our branch. The CEO simply stared at him. He let them feel the silence, just as he had done with the manager. The chairman cleared his throat. We are prepared to offer you a settlement to resolve this matter privately. A folder slid across the table. The CEO opened it. His lawyer leaned over, glancing at the number. $10 million. The chairman forced a smile. A gesture of goodwill. The CEO chuckled, shaking his head. You think this is about money? The chairman's smile stiffened. The chairman's jaw clenched. That's a lot. The CEO smirked. That's the point. Silence filled the room. Finally, the chairman exhaled. We'll discuss this internally and get back to you. The CEO stood. Take your time. The public isn't going anywhere. He walked out, leaving them scrambling. The war wasn't won. But the battle was his. The CEO sat in his office, watching the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The board of directors had been rattled, but he knew they weren't going to roll over easily. They were businessmen, powerful, connected, and skilled at covering their tracks. His lawyer sat across from him, arms crossed. They're stalling. He nodded. I expected that. They think this will blow over, she continued. That the public will move on. He smirked. They don't know me very well. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was the bank manager. He answered. Talk. The manager's voice was nervous. I have something for you. Internal emails. Proof that this wasn't just me. The whole system was built to make it harder for certain people to access their money. The CEO exchanged a look with his lawyer. Where did you get them? He asked. The manager hesitated. Let's just say. I had access to things most people don't. The CEO leaned back. Send them. A moment later, his inbox pinged. His lawyer pulled up the files. As she scrolled through, her expression hardened. This is worse than we thought. The CEO glanced over. The emails outlined unwritten policies instructing employees to flag certain transactions if the customer looked suspicious. And suspicious, in this case, almost always meant Black or minority customers. The CEO exhaled slowly. They built a system to legally discriminate. His lawyer's eyes gleamed. And now, we have proof. He stood up, rolling his shoulders. Set up a press conference. We're taking this public. The final strike. The press conference was packed. Reporters, cameras, even some of the customers who had reached out after hearing his story. The world was watching. The CEO stepped up to the podium. He didn't have to raise his voice. The silence was heavy, charged with anticipation. He pulled out a folder and held it up. What I have here, he said, is proof of what many have suspected for years. He laid out the emails, displaying them for everyone to see. A system that quietly, legally, and deliberately targeted people based on nothing but assumptions. A system designed to keep money in the hands of a few, while making others jump through hoops just to access what's already theirs. Cameras flashed. Journalists furiously scribbled notes. The bank tried to silence me. They thought throwing money at me would make me go away. He smiled coldly. They were wrong. A reporter stood. What happens next? The CEO met her gaze. Accountability. The bank's collapse. The fallout was immediate. The bank was forced into a full-scale investigation. Federal regulators stepped in. Lawsuits started piling up from customers who had been victims of the same discrimination. Within a week, the CEO's story had reached Congress. The chairman of the board was forced to resign. The manager had already been fired, but it wasn't enough to stop the storm. The entire executive team was being investigated. The CEO watched it all unfold, his expression unreadable. His lawyer sat beside him. You did it. He exhaled. Not yet. She raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He turned to her. We burned down the old system. Now, we have to build something better. A new beginning. A few months later, the CEO stood in front of a different podium. But this time, it wasn't a press conference. It was an announcement. Today, I'm launching a new initiative, he said. A bank that isn't built on exclusion. A bank that doesn't judge you by how you look, but by how hard you've worked. A bank that belongs to the people. The room erupted in applause. He looked out at the faces before him, young entrepreneurs, struggling families, people who had been denied opportunities because of bias. This was bigger than revenge. Bigger than a lawsuit. This was about change. He had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The CEO stood at the center of the stage, the applause still ringing in his ears. He had just announced something that would shake the financial world, a bank designed for the people, by the people. A place where success wasn't determined by race, background, or old money connections. He scanned the crowd, seeing faces filled with hope. Entrepreneurs. Small business owners. Families who had fought through rejection after rejection from traditional banks. People who had dreams, but no access. This was his moment. Not just to celebrate, but to remind them why this fight mattered. He stepped forward, gripping the podium. I started this journey because of one moment, he said, his voice steady. A moment that should have been simple. I walked into a bank that had my money, money I earned, money I worked for, and they refused to give it to me. The audience nodded. They had seen the story. They had felt the outrage. But that moment was bigger than me, he continued. Because the truth is, I wasn't alone. For years, thousands, millions of people have faced the same roadblocks. They've been questioned, doubted, denied. Not because of their credentials. Not because they lacked financial knowledge. But because someone, somewhere, decided they didn't belong. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. That system is broken, he said. And when something is broken beyond repair, you don't fix it. His eyes swept across the crowd. You replace it. The end of an era. Meanwhile, across the city, the bank that had denied him his money was crumbling. The boardroom that had once been filled with power brokers was now filled with lawyers and investigators. The chairman had resigned. Multiple executives were facing lawsuits. Stockholders were pulling out. A once great institution, built on exclusion and hidden biases, was falling apart. The manager, the man who had once stood smugly behind the counter, now sat in a hearing room, facing a government panel. He looked nothing like the man who had dismissed the CEO so easily that day. His face was pale, his hands gripping the edges of the desk. He was being questioned about every decision he had made, about every customer he had turned away. And for the first time, he had no power. Building something new. Weeks passed. The CEO's vision was coming to life. His new bank, built on fairness and accessibility, was gaining momentum. Investors who had once ignored the idea were now eager to be a part of it. People who had been rejected by traditional banking systems were lining up to join. He stood in his new office, a different kind of office. Not in a high-rise tower looking down on the world, but on the ground floor, where he could see the people he was serving. His assistant walked in, holding a tablet. Sir, applications are through the roof. We're already at capacity for the first wave. He smiled. Good. Let's make room for more. She hesitated. Also, the old bank just declared bankruptcy. He exhaled, nodding. He wasn't happy about it, nor did he feel vindicated. This wasn't about destroying something, it was about creating something better. And that was exactly what he had done. The life lesson. Later that evening, he sat down for an interview. The host, a well-known journalist, looked at him with admiration. You had every right to take that settlement, she said. To walk away with millions and let it all fade into the past. But you didn't. Why? The CEO smiled, leaning forward. Because success isn't just about what you earn, he said. It's about what you change. The host nodded, visibly moved. And what do you hope people take away from your story? He thought for a moment, then said. No one should have to prove they belong. If you've worked for something, if you've earned it, if you've built it, you belong. And no system, no institution, and no person should ever have the power to tell you otherwise. The interview ended, but the impact never would. His story was no longer just about one man denied his money. It was about all the people who had been denied their opportunities. And now, thanks to him, they finally had a chance.